One of the major categories in human connection is our ability to communicate to each other and our ability to find that communication and identify how easy does it feel to communicate with someone.
I always say that the secret to being a very good, strong communicator is learning how to listen and having that power of that pause. But for many of us, we don't know how to listen. So some of the default ways that we actually fall into are listening to respond. So, okay, we're not present, right? We're just thinking of our answer. Maybe we feel like we need to defend ourselves.
We all know that sometimes we meet someone and in our connection or relationship, it can be really beautiful and everything flows and it's easy. It's like being on a nice, lazy river. And other times, every time we try to do anything, it feels tension. That was an interesting lesson for me, which is sometimes instead of trying to change someone's actions, we can just adjust our own and be okay with it. I am here with Amira Mansour, and she is the communication expert. Today, we're going to talk about communication in relation to the connection map. One of the major categories in human connection is our ability to communicate to each other and our ability to find that communication and identify how easy does it feel to communicate with someone. We all know that sometimes we meet someone and in our connection or relationship, it can be really beautiful and everything flows and it's easy. It's like being on a nice, lazy river. And other times, every time we try to do anything, it feels tension and aggression. And we feel like, oh my God, I just asked them to pass me the salt. Why is this so difficult? So Amira, my first question to you is that ease of communication that we feel with people, is that instinctual? Is that coming from a personality and the way that they go together? Is it coming from skill level? A little bit of both? What are your opinions on this?
What a beautiful question to start with. I love the insight. So I think one of the common misconceptions is I'm not a good communicator or I'm not a confident communicator because that's just not who I am. And I think that it gets too deeply linked to our personality. And if we're a good communicator, if communication comes to us in an easeful way, if it's done in a healthy way, then the key thing is that we've learned it as a skill. And that skill becomes good and we master it. And the more or the better we get at it, the more confident we feel. So I think that's the first thing to understand. Now, beautiful question when you talk about when we have that ease and that connection with someone. Usually that initial ease and connection with somebody comes from a space of we've probably got very similar values that are underpinning how we communicate. It may also link to what's our inherent dominant communication style, because as humans, we tend to connect with people that are most like us. So it's easy to communicate with somebody that communicates in the same way that you do. So if you're pretty focused, you like focusing on the end result, you're getting things done, you probably work quite quickly. You can sometimes be tunnel visioned. If somebody's going to replicate that and respond in a similar way, you're going to appreciate that. You're going to feel connected. And same thing, taking it back to your values. If you both have very similar core values, the way you connect and interact with each other is way more likely to be aligned. So I would say they're probably the key component of what makes that communication, that interaction and that relationship feel like a really good, strong one.
So there's many things in there that I'm curious about. One is I'm hearing that the ease of communication you feel is reliant on the value alignment and potentially the lifestyle alignment. Do you think that's true? So the more that we're in alignment with our values and lifestyle, you think our communication is going to be easier by default?
By default, definitely. It doesn't mean that we have to sit in that space and that's the only space that we can communicate well from and that everybody else, we've lost hope. But if we're coming from a space right now of looking at our relationships and where is communication working well for us and where is it not, it's probably working really well and feeling natural because of those components. So the short answer to that is yes.
So the next question is, you talked about their dominant communication styles. What are the options? What are someone's dominant communication styles? Like, what could they be? What are the options here?
So there are 4 communication styles, and usually we will have a dominant communication style. Now, over time, if you've become aware of what your dominant communication style is, then you tend to learn to adapt it, which is great. It's a great space we want to be in. So the 4 are a driver. I'll go through each of them first of all, and then I'll give you a little bit of a description. So the first one is a driver communication style. The second communication style, and these are in no particular order, are an amiable communication style. Next, we have an expressive communication style, and then we have an analytical communication style. So a driver, if that's your dominant way of communicating, kind of alluded to it already, is very much around the end goal, being quite goal and focused orientated. So in terms of how does that come across when you communicate, it's usually quite direct, quite succinct, and to the point. So it doesn't mean, and the one thing about communication styles is I don't want to box people in. It doesn't mean you can't have any other type of conversation, but that's probably what you lean towards. Then we've got an amiable communication style, which is very much way more focused on people and relationships. So you're going to be a lot more focused on how do people feel. So when you communicate, you're going to take other people's feelings far more into consideration, perhaps than if a driver communication is your dominant style. Then we've got expressive, which is slightly different to amiable, and sometimes they can feel like quite closely linked. But if you've got a real expressive way of communicating, then you tend to really focus on like the bigger picture. You love to communicate ideas and like the vision and the way forward. And that's what gets you excited. So you might not want to talk about like the detail or how you're going to do something. And then lastly, probably no surprise, we've got our lovely analytical communicators. Now, sometimes people can't always see this one, or they get a little bit antsy when they're like, that's not me. I don't like communicate like that. But if you are an analytical communicator, you love to kind of focus more on the detail, more on information and evidence as well. So you will focus on perhaps processes, like a flow of something being quite logical, something being quite methodical. And in the way that you communicate, you're probably a lot more focused on, is something correct and is it fair? So you're perhaps going to take a lot more of a well thought out process before you communicate. So for example, time to reflect could be important to you before you then communicate. And that also is a really good example when we talk about relationships and when you might want to communicate. But they are the 4 styles, and they're a little bit more around actually what did each one mean.
That sounds, I've never even heard of these 4 communication styles. I mean, definitely aggressive, right? We know everyone that has an aggressive communication style, and analytical makes sense. Driver also. So driver is basically when you're trying to get to a goal, essentially. That's the short of it, right?
Yes, definitely.
And you're communicating in a way that is the idea that you're kind of manipulating the conversation to get to that goal, or trying to like drive it to that goal, or is it just that like that you have a specific goal in mind and therefore you're communicating in that style?
So you've just raised a beautiful question. I'm going to bring in something else in the hope that this also isn't going to create confusion. So I want to explain this in a really clear way. So those 4 styles I talk about tend to be more of like your communication personality, if I had to describe it, right? It's how you like naturally like to communicate. It's more of your social communication style. Now, separate to that, we've got actually what is a healthy way of communicating. So keep those in mind. Remember that most of us have a dominant one, but we can change and we can adapt. Now, for each one, and we can go through this if it's helpful, there'll be strengths and there'll be cons. So each one is a good thing and we want to play to that. But we need to be aware of like, what are your blind spots and how can it come across to somebody else? Now, running alongside that is what is actually healthy communication. And I always say there is only one way, despite people disagreeing with me. So the one healthy way of communicating is through assertiveness. And I think that many of us weren't taught it, we weren't role modeled it, and so we don't know how to do it. So exactly as you already alluded to, is sometimes without even knowing, we will fall into a passive aggressive communication style, a manipulative communication style, an aggressive one, or a passive one. I was making sure I didn't forget them. And these can be very interchangeable. So somebody recently said to me, Amira, I've had so much feedback that I come across as aggressive. I've tried to tone it down so much that I now come across as passive aggressive. So these are not very set at all. And it might be that you're assertive in lots of areas, but maybe with one person in your life, you feel that you can't be. So you either overdo it and become too assertive, aka aggressive, or you feel that you do it in an underhand way, which could come across as manipulative. How much sense does that make when I put it all together?
Absolute sense. So I think that the thing that people really want to know is what are the ways that I can be a better communicator, right? That's probably the thing that they want to get to right away. So let's start from the beginning. If you met someone who's never taken any of these classes or workshops, never read any of the books on communication, what's the first thing that you would teach them to become a better communicator?
I love when we get to start from the beginning and like, what is step one? So step one for me is always, which we've kind of covered off already, is knowing your communication style. Now, once you know that, I want to take that a little bit further. It's also understanding what is your communication blueprint. So understanding your communication blueprint means let's do a little bit of mapping backward. Let's understand, where are you communicating in a way that's not healthy? Because if you've got to this space where you're inquiring about your communication and the way that you show up, that usually gives us an indication that something's not working. So once you know your communication style, I would then suggest, let's map out your communication blueprint. So let's look at how you grew up. Let's look at what behaviors did you see role modeled? Because sometimes when we aren't a great communicator, it's because we haven't learned how. And actually what we've picked up is some unhealthy communication habit. But because we don't know any better, we don't know how to change it or how to do it differently. So communication styles, and with that is also understanding where are your blind spots. So what's going to make you a better communicator? All right, well, how are you able to adapt? How are you able to influence and do something differently? That has to come from, first of all, knowing what are your blind spots. So for example, do you rush sometimes and only think about like where you want to get to? And you sometimes can miss how people feel, or sometimes you actually don't focus on the detail and actually the process of something. Sometimes do you focus too much on like the vision and the ideas, and you actually don't think enough about details. So there's pros and cons to everything. So once you know that communication style, get really clear on like what your blind spot. Every single one of them must have them. And a good space to start is what frustrates you. So whether you take like a romantic relationship or take a work scenario, who frustrates you? Because that's going to be a really good mirror to hold up and say, okay, well, why do they frustrate me? And it's probably going to be because they're communicating in a way that's your blind spot. And so that means you're going to have to work a hell of a lot harder. So that's kind of the first and second thing in terms of then map out and start to understand, what do you do that perhaps you just picked up and is a learned behavior?
Okay, so first of all, go find someone that frustrates you, and that's what you're going to have to work on. I'm pretty sure the listeners, that's the last thing that they wanted to go find someone frustrating, and then and recognize that it's really our responsibility to work on that. But what I'm hearing, really, the first thing is to figure out what your communication style, your communication blueprint is. And once we figure that, so again, the communication blueprint, is that different than the four communication styles, or is that a synonymous word?
Slightly different, because your communication blueprint is more about piecing your whole entire picture and like your story together. So how did you grow up? Like, how many siblings do you have? What was that interaction like in your household? Did you grow up with loads of siblings and you felt actually like you never got a voice? Because that's probably going to feed into then if you're an adult and you find it difficult to speak up and use your voice. So the communication styles piece is separate. Your blueprint, think about it more of your whole entire story and your map that's got you to the way that you communicate now. Because there'll be things in there that you already do really well. And it kind of links back to your point around, well, what makes you a good communicator? Like, how do we get to that space? One, it's definitely practice, but when we become a hell of a lot more aware, and I know I really talk about this a lot, but without that awareness piece, I could, for example, especially with my one-to-one client, go through the tools to so that you become more assertive. We can look at your language. We can focus on actually like being aware of your blind spot. But if we don't actually have an understanding and start to piece things together, you won't embed those practical tools. So I'm really about, okay, let's shift the mindset and let's also learn the practical tools. So that shifts the way you communicate for your lifetime, not something that you constantly feel that you fall back into and back out of. So yeah, that communication blueprint is very much your story and understanding, okay, like where do you feel assertive and why do you feel assertive? Perhaps, for example, you had a great role model from a parent or a caregiver where you saw them really show up from a work perspective in a great way. They were able to be a really good leader and you got to, for example, work with them at some point. So there's lots of good things you'll take out of understanding your blueprint as well. And then from there, we can really look at, okay, what's lacking? Why do you feel that you can't speak up? Why do you feel, for example, so I had somebody recently say to me, I'm at a space where I feel that people don't understand me. And I feel that I'm a good communicator, but actually my partner, like I got recent feedback and I communicated something at work and they said I came across as patronizing, condescending, and I thought I was more superior than them. But I don't feel that. So what am I doing as to how that's coming across? So usually that's going to tell me that you're overdoing something. So I talk quite generically because the way everybody communicates has so much nuance to it. So it's about looking deeper into you. Once we find those spots that feel difficult, okay, well, how are we going to do that differently? So I want you to ask yourself, is it something you have to tone down when you're communicating, or is it something you need to tone up and do more of? And usually, if you're sitting on like a passive side of that scale, you need to dial up and learn how to be more assertive. If you're coming across as too strong, and sometimes passion can come across as aggressive. And I get lots of questions in my DMs saying, but Amira, I'm passionate and people are misconstruing this as aggression. Okay, well, how do we still maintain the passion, but do it in a way where it can be receptive and people can take that on? I don't know if I've gone off on a tangent or if that's answered your question.
I think just trying to understand, for me, I'm interested in giving myself and those like practical ways of like increasing, because I also feel that communication is a crucial part of connection. And I've noticed that those that are good communicators tend to have much healthier relationships. And those that have much healthier relationships tend to be happier. And that's something that I'm interested in personally. And I think others are too. So just really trying to understand how to become a better communicator. But one thing I'm realizing in this conversation is we haven't defined what is a good communicator or what is healthy communication. Do you have a definition for us? Like, you are a communication expert. How do you define it?
Most definitely. So if I'm going to say it in a sentence or two, I feel like you already set us up really well for this question, but being a good communicator means that you are able to communicate what you need, express yourself in a really authentic way, and do it in a mindful way where you can respect somebody else's need. And
Mm,
sometimes I think that we really misconstrue and think being a good communicator means agreeing. It doesn't. Disagreement is really healthy. Like being able to challenge each other, being able to have different perspectives is what's going to open up our mind. It's what's going to challenge us. It's what's going to give us a different perspective and a different way of communicating. So really being able to be a good communicator means being able to address our needs, communicate them in a clear, direct and assertive way,
mm.
and do it from a very authentic space. So as much as I talk about adapting, I also always want to honor how do you want to operate authentically, what's important to you. And whilst we've got that piece, how do you then take into consideration other people's needs? How are you being mindful of that? You're not dismissing yours, but equally, you're not dismissing theirs.
Mm. Okay, so to be a good communicator, I need to express my needs and desires in a clear, concise way. Uh, do it in a way that is, you said, is assertive and also mindful of their need, of someone else's needs that I'm communicating with. That sound right?
Absolutely spot on.
All right. I think that's something that we can all aspire to, right? Okay, so give us a hint. How do we get there? Like for example, for me, things that I've learned that has been really useful in communication is really just asking asking questions that are authentic questions, and then really listening and letting someone finish without interrupting, and then giving them a second, and then letting it wait a second when they're done speaking before answering, and really thinking about the answer, not while they're talking, but really just listening. So that's like an example of communication that I find really useful. Do you have other ones for myself or for others?
Definitely. I'm going to expand a little bit on your point because I feel like that is a great tool. And I want to just give a little bit of a model around it because I think that we talk about, and I think you've kind of mentioned this. So I want to take it probably a little bit more practical now because it's great when we understand the
Great.
concepts and we've become aware. But usually the question, especially when you're listening, is like, okay, I get it. Now, what do I do differently? I always say that the secret to being a very good, strong communicator is learning how to listen and having that power of that pause. But for many of us, like we don't know how to listen. So some of the default ways that we actually fall into are listening to respond. So, okay, we're not present, right? We're just thinking of our answer. Maybe we feel like we need to defend ourselves. Maybe we need to feel like we need to justify it or explain. Sometimes we fall into the space of listening to fix and to offer a solution. And often that comes from our need of like wanting to help and like be a good friend or be a supportive partner. But often when somebody wants to share something and feel heard and understood, it's nothing to do with you trying to fix the solution for them. Another way that we tend to like listen and fall into that's not healthy or serving us is listening to elevate ourselves. And sometimes this can happen more in like a work situation, or it could happen with your partner if you're trying to, if you feel that it's a little bit competitive, if you have to prove yourself, you will listen for bits of information where you then can feel that you're a little bit more superior. So on that note, a lovely listening model that I love to share, it's not mine, but it's called Raza. So RASA, and I'm going to talk you through it very briefly. So the first one when we're listening and how to listen better is, are we receiving the information? So how are you being present? Because too often, especially in the world that we live in, we're multitasking, we're doing an email, you join a Teams call for work, but really you're answering your emails, or you're like, how much other stuff can I get done? Even when your partner sits with you at home and says, hey, like I've had a bad day. Are you on your phone? Are you scrolling? Are you watching TV? So first of all, how are you receiving the message? That means being present. The second one is, I want you to appreciate the message. So often when we aren't listening, I hear people then fall straight into listen to respond, appreciate their message, acknowledge. A really good example is if you're at work and you happen to be like a front facing team and somebody calls and says, hey, I'm not happy about this. Appreciate the message, like acknowledge it. It could sound like, that sounds difficult. Let me see how I can help. Rather than just skirting over it or bypassing it. If your partner said, I had a hard day, okay, appreciate the message. Tell me more. So appreciating the message is really important. Then the third part of that is summarize. So recap back what you've heard. There's no harm in it. It gives you such a greater understanding. And I think this is just a beautiful model to help you focus more on listening rather than feeling like you have to talk. And then last one, which you've already mentioned, and it's a whole topic in itself, but really a beautiful way of clarifying when you're listening, is ask questions. So tell me more, like, why did that feel so difficult? So you can get a deeper understanding. And I think it really helps you shift the focus when you're thinking about how to be a better communicator. You don't have to do all the talking, but sometimes we've been programmed to think that we do, or if we don't speak up, that we don't have valid enough ideas. But if you can really channel that listening, then that's a really good space. I hope that model, first of all, is helpful. And then I can give a couple of other tools, but I thought I'd pause there.
That's a fantastic model. So Raza, you called.
Yeah. So
So receive.
receive the information, be present when you're listening, appreciate the message. So acknowledge it, like actually say a statement to show that you've heard what they've said, summarize. So recap back what you've heard. So you've said X, this is what I'm understanding. Does that sound right? Did I understand that correctly? And then ask questions to follow up and to clarify. That sounds difficult. Tell me more. Why did that feel so hard? Questions like that. And that's going to allow you to be present and mindful.
Yes, I have found that to be it's interesting. Sometimes I find it really interesting when people are not aware of this and they go on and they speak for a long time and then you summarize and then they speak for a long time again and they don't ever get to asking you any questions. And at the end, they say something like, "Oh my God, that was the best conversation I've ever had." And you're thinking in your head, you literally just talked about yourself the entire time. And that's probably why you think it was the best conversation. But I think is a great model. Is there any other little tricks like that that you've heard of or that you've come across that you find that you think listeners could be interested in?
I think remembering, I guess just expanding on in terms of like the listening element and why it's so important is we tend to be really scared of like the power of pause and silence because we think like we don't know enough or we're not showing up in the way that we want to. So remembering that there's nothing wrong in silence and learning how to pause. And you are right, going back to when we talk about those people that think it was a great conversation, and you think, really? Like, you want as well when you got me to define like what makes a good communicator, what makes you strong at it. You want it to be an interaction and a dialogue, and that means that that conversation is going to shift. Listening is super important, but it's really different if somebody's actively coming to you to share something difficult with you. Okay, then you need to be even more present to listen. Versus if, for example, you and I are in this conversation, right? And yes, you tend to be asking me way more questions today because that's the nature of our conversation. But how are you creating that dialogue? And if we're feeling good and we're feeling safe in that space, then there will be times where you're going to share and you're going to talk a little bit more. That's okay. And I think to expand on it, and this depends what situation, but it's quite good to think about like a rule in terms, and this doesn't mean get your stopwatch out, okay? But think about like a 20-second rule in a conversation. You can get your point across pretty quickly. And what tends to happen is we'll over explain, we'll say the same thing in 3 different sentences, and then you've lost your point already. So see if you can actually get your initial point across in like under 60 seconds. That doesn't mean rush it and like get your stopwatch out, but it's a really great way to then pause and ensure that you're not talking too much because it allows the other person to respond. So just kind of building on from listening, when you talk about are there other tools, it's like a 20-second rule. Are you talking more than 20 seconds feel like quite harsh, but let's say like a 60-second rule. Like, are you talking for more than 60 seconds without taking a breath or a pause? Because actually, if you both then have that shift, depending on the type of conversation, you're going to flow a hell of a lot more between it rather than it becoming a monologue.
So 60-second, like keep an eye out. The rule of thumb to be a good communicator is try not to go on these long rants, keep them short, try to get your point across, and then pause. And even if you don't have your point across, you'll have an opportunity to continue, but give someone else space to speak because, I mean, let's be honest, there's nothing more frustrating than someone going on a monologue and then when it's time for you to respond, they've hit 16 different points and you don't feel like you can really, really attach to any one of them, or you're like, oh my God, what do I choose to speak about? Because I feel like I only get a little space here to be able to respond to all these things that someone's speaking about. So I really resonate with that. But I haven't heard the 60 seconds, but that sounds about right. Cause I think sometimes I go on about 10, 30 minutes. So I don't know. Some of my partners have told me that.
But it's true, right? And it's not saying like you must follow it. But I think, when you talk about the practical tips and the tools, when we don't know like how we're coming across, one, great, listen to that feedback. And then at least it gives you a little bit of a benchmark to say, okay, let me pause here. I don't have to over explain. And once you map out your communication blueprint, you'll understand why in some situations you feel like you have to over talk. I interviewed a lovely guest the other day for a podcast, and he said, Loads of people don't ask me how I am. And he said, I'm a really good listener. But what I've noticed is when somebody does then ask how I am, it opens up the floodgate and I just don't know when to stop. So having a little bit of a benchmark will help, right? I think there's one other thing, Joel, is going to link in here as well that just could be quite useful when we're thinking about how to be a good communicator is language is really important. So I know I've talked a lot around being clear and being concise and being direct. And one, I think, like really good tool that's going to feel like quite a quick win is filler words. When I talk about coming across in an assertive way, in a direct way, I want us to think about, can you remove filler words or filler sentences that undermine how you come across? So as an example, your filler word would be, oh, would you mind if I just is your filler word. It means that when you take it out of the sentence, you don't need it. So even other words such as like superlative words, like really, or if you said to your partner, you never do this, like it sounds like you're exaggerating. If we start to remove all of those words from our language, and it doesn't mean never use them, because I usually get challenged at this point and somebody will say, yeah, but like it's not really affecting what I'm saying. You want to be a good communicator. It means coming across and you want to sound confident. If you say, could you just do this? Or there's a little thing, you've undermined what you said and you're really going to lose the power in what you're saying. So again, if you're communicating to your partner how you feel and you say, well, it's just not that big of a deal, but all right, well, it is a big deal. So how can we reframe that and say, hey, I've been thinking about X. I want to share this because I'd love for us to find a solution. That is a beautiful reframe. So just one other thing I wanted to say when you asked about like practical tools, let's look at language. Let's take out those filler words that we don't need. Let's also take out the superlatives that sound like we're exaggerating, that sound like that person is like doing something really badly all the time, because it's also going to trigger such a defensive reaction. And when you already said, Amira, like the better we are at communicating, the better our relationships are. 100%.
I love that. So we need to take out basically be cognitive of our filler words, not just the ums and the buts, but like, and also be really cautious to make it sound like something is always, you always do this. Um, and that actually brings me to something interesting, which is, a big lesson that I learned in communication is this idea of bringing everything back to me. Instead of saying, Amira, you made me feel this way, or you did this to me. I learned a communication style, which is, I felt this way when this happened. So, for example, when you said this, Amira, I felt hurt, or I felt marginalized, or I felt this way, instead of you made me feel this way. And that was a really big revelation to me in communication, not just in being able to communicate better to others, but also to take responsibility for my own emotions and actions. And I'm not sure exactly where that style comes from, if that was from nonviolent communication or not, or someplace else, but I found that to be super useful. And if there's other things that you have like that, I think that we can, if there's ways to teach people even little things can go a long way.
I think that's probably one of my most favorite things. I kind of put it under the umbrella of like taking ownership, but definitely around like the non-violent communication, because the power of switching you to I, and I'm going to take it a step further and I'm going to give you a framework because I think this is going to be helpful, okay? Because this really steps us into the space of conflict, of having hard conversations and how we view conflict and why we might avoid it or why we might do it in not the most constructive way. You are not the only person I have heard that has said, when I learned swapping you to I, it was one of the biggest game changers for me. It's probably one of the biggest bits of feedback I hear around. And I think sometimes when we think about being a better communicator, we actually forget how powerful the small things are. And if you shift a few things consistently, you're going to step away from feeling that you're not a good communicator, you're not confident enough. Maybe you're too aggressive, and step into a space where you feel confident and that you're doing it in a healthy way. So just to expand on what you said, first of all, yes, the power of switching you to I is so incredible. I really believe, as you said already, that it's your responsibility. It's about taking ownership. Now, I usually say and guide my clients that You are responsible for how you feel. Nobody made you feel that way. So please don't put that onto somebody else. When you turn around and you say to your partner, well, you made me feel this, they didn't. They might have acted in a way that you don't like, and that's fine. However, you have your feelings and you're responsible for them. So shifting that to take ownership is also really empowering for yourself. And then exactly as you said, it steps us out of that non-violent communication. We reduce actually the likelihood of going into conflict and triggering a defensive response. So I'm going to give you a model as well, which I think is going to be really helpful to have hard conversation. But as soon as somebody says to you, if somebody said it to me, even now, even after all the work I've done, and said, well, Amira, you never do this. Or let's say my partner said to me, you never wash up. Or I've walked in and like you always leave the house untidy. To this day, it's probably still going to trigger me. So I know I've expanded on what you said, but it was such a beautiful point. So is it helpful, Joe, if I take us through a bit more of a model that's going to take that into consideration, that's going to help us have hard conversations, especially if we struggle to do them in a healthy way?
Let's do it. That sounds fantastic.
Okay, so the model is called PAID. I've probably used it for so long, and I feel that it's really the crux of helping us communicate how we feel, be direct about it, and do it in a way where it's going to land well. Okay, so P stands for positive intention. Now, you don't necessarily need to communicate this to somebody else, but I want you to ask yourself, when you're having this conversation that perhaps you're avoiding or you feel a little bit awkward about, you're not sure how to say it. I had somebody ask me really recently, I need to have a hard conversation with my friend. They've borrowed something and they've not returned it in the way that I gave it to them. It's a really expensive piece of clothing. This is not the first time that it's happened, and I'm really upset about it. And I really don't want to lend them anything anymore. First of all, what's the positive intention? Not for you, but for them. Why do you want to have this conversation with them? So many of my clients will say to me, Amira, there's no point. Like, they're not going to change. Why am I going to bother to have it? What we want to be able to do is give somebody the benefit of the doubt because they might not be able to see it. So the positive intention usually is going to come down to something around it helping your relationship, whether it's personal, whether it's family, friend, whether it's somebody at work. So why do you want to have the conversation? What is a positive outcome that could come out of it? That's the first thing. Then the next thing before we get onto your beautiful point is the action. What has happened that is factual that you can bring into the conversation? Because going into like what we've already said, well, you never wash up. Okay, not helpful. It's also not a fact. We want to start with a fact and an action because it helps ground the conversation and also means there's less room for like conflict to ensue. So, for example, in that situation, that person shared with their friend, I borrowed you my dress last week. However, when you've returned it, there's a rip on this side of it and there's also a stain. So that's a factual piece of information. That isn't saying you never return my clothes to me in the same condition I give it to you in. It's referring to a specific recent example. And whenever we focus on the fact, I want you to think about it being specific and as accurate as you can without it feeling like you're bringing up, like you've kept a log of all the things they've done wrong, but just keep it very specific to the point. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. So we got positive attention and action, which is the facts.
And then we move on to I, which is the impact, which is exactly what you've already spoken about. The impact is, what is the impact that it had on you? How did you feel? And that goes straight into, as a result of you borrowing my dress and not returning it in the condition that I gave it to you in, I feel that you haven't been respectful, or I feel that my clothes haven't been respected, or that it's not as important to you to return it into that condition. So really start with, I feel X. But because you started with what's happened, it's more likely to be received in a positive way. And then we move on to the last point, which is really about the desired outcome. And I always describe this as the full stop on your sentence, which we forget. Like, this is how you want to round off a hard conversation. So what's the suggestion? What's the way of moving forward that you want to do this differently? And this is where you really communicate your need. It might be, for example, that this is the 5th time it's happened and you don't want to lend them your clothes anymore. That's completely fine. Or it might be that you want to say to them, moving forward, I would love that when you're returning my clothes, it could be in the same condition that I've given it to you. Or it could be something like, this has happened a couple of times and I don't feel comfortable lending you my clothes anymore. So I would rather, in order to not create more friction between us, that we don't do that. So that's the model as a whole with an example.
Yes. Amira, I'm sorry I didn't return your dress in the condition that you let me borrow it. It got a little wild the other night, and I take responsibility and I understand the impact it's had, and I understand that it makes you feel like I don't care about your things, but I do care. I just got a little out of control the other night, so I'm sorry.
Thank you, Joe. Like, I really appreciate that you've acknowledged it and you've apologized.
Yes, and I will also, with your paid model, I will also pay for the dress, Amira. It's just uh, so we can round out that paid communication. You got a new dress, new expensive dress. Um, what a fantastic model using this paid, the positive. What was it? Started with the positive intention, and then the action and the fact, and then the I is the impact it had on us, and then D is what our desired outcome. What is that we want with this? Which it's funny because I find myself sometimes forgetting about the D and being completely fine just getting to the I of like, hey, I just want to share that this is how it impacted me, and and to be honest with you, feeling quite okay if I feel that that is received. And someone goes, wow, yeah, I really understand why that impacted you that way. Usually for me, I'm good. I don't necessarily always need a desired, a desired outcome, because I found that many times it's really just about me and having to let go and reframe my perspective on the thing that was hard for me. Whether in that communication or if someone did something, it's like, because let's be honest, we can't change anyone's actions ever. And as much as, especially when we have potential partnerships or specifically in romantic partnerships, man, we want it so easy to want to change somebody. It's so easy to be like, you know, get them to try to do the dishes more, clean up more, uh and the reality is people are just gonna do what they want to do. So is there ways to kind of reframe our perspective and just let them be them? Is sometimes can be more useful than trying to get someone to do something different. Here's a story. I remember I want to say it was my mother was very annoyed that my father would always leave the kitchen cabinet doors open. He'd look for dishes and go get dishes or whatever it is. He'd just leave the doors open. And it used to drive her crazy. And she would always be like, always get on him, tried all these different things to get him to close the cabinet doors. And he just, for whatever reason, just couldn't remember, didn't want to remember, who knows. And so she said what changed for her is when she realized all she had to do was just shut the door, and it was actually solve the problem, and she could just love him and continue to love him. And it took away the resistance and the tension between them, was she just would shut the doors, and it was a lot easier than trying to get him to shut the doors. And that was an interesting lesson for me, which is sometimes instead of trying to change someone's actions, we can just adjust our own and be okay with it.
I think that's a beautiful example, actually, because there's probably like 2 or 3 points that we can just pull out of there that's really healthy. Really helpful when we think about healthy communication. So definitely it's always about you when you're communicating, and you're so right that you can never change anybody else. So that's not the goal. The goal is how am I able to adapt in a way and still maintain my authenticity to help this relationship. And I love that, yeah, you being able to witness that as well was like, actually, she found a different solution. So I think if you're coming from a space where you're trying to change somebody else, exactly as you said, the reframe is really important. And it also goes back to being able to manage expectations, because a lot of friction comes from expecting people to behave or communicate in the way that we operate. And then also, I'm going to just challenge it slightly and say that in that situation, that feels like it was actually a really good solution. So it's also about being mindful, like you don't need to communicate. Healthy communication is not about communicating every thought you ever have or every frustration you ever have. And it is about that balance between, is it helpful here? And I think that's why it goes back to the positive intention. Why am I doing it? Because if you question it and it's like, well, I'm just pissed off and it's just so that I can get my frustrations out. Okay, not helpful, not helpful. So I just love that story because there's actually, like a few really good points in there that help us think about it differently. So think about why you're communicating something. Is it something that's big enough? And also, what's that type of relationship? So for mum in that situation, it was a smaller thing that actually she could reframe and that it wasn't that big of a deal. And also in that example, if there's something else that's frustrating you, it's a good question to ask why. Why is that really, like, why is it winding me up? Why is it frustrating me? Is there a different way around it? And I think that balance is really important as well. Not every thought you have, you don't need to tell your partner every single thought. That's not the point of healthy, open communication. There's a balance.
So what I'm hearing is it's important to communicate if there's a positive intention associated with it. So if I feel like this communicating this will do something positive for them or for us, and I think that's a really good framework to be looking at, because sometimes we're just in our process, and sometimes we're just thinking things, and when we find that by not communicating, we're starting to build resentment, starting to, feel more disconnected from our partner or our friend or our colleague by not communicating, then that is our positive intention. Our intention is, if we don't communicate, it's going to continue to have a separation and a break in the connection. So yes, I think that's a great way that model. Do you have any more of these good ones, Amira? These are fantastic.
I was like, have I given you too many or is it useful? I hate overloading.
I mean, you're also talking to someone whose like core value is curiosity and education. So, and also communication and connection. So it's, this is fantastic for me. And I know that you've been doing this for a long time. So you probably have quite a bit of knowledge. Is there anything that we haven't talked about that you feel like is like pressing and is like, like, oh my God, people need to know about this when it comes to communication?
Well, it kind of leads on to like the question you just asked before in terms of like, Amira, give me another model. I love the fact that you're curious and it aligns with our interview and how it's gone. So I think the one thing that might be a useful thing to kind of touch on before we wrap up is, and in terms of another model, is understanding conflict a little bit better. So it's been a beautiful lead in to what you said around, okay, what you're understanding is there a positive intention? I don't think I could have asked you to summarize that any better. So definitely around what are we communicating? Why are we communicating? Is it that there's a breakdown if I don't communicate this? And actually, is this going to serve us and help build a healthier relationship? Beautiful. It gives us a lovely segue into conflict and understanding a little bit better. So the first thing I say is, and this goes back to something else when you said about reframing it. So first of all, understanding like, what does conflict mean to you? Because I get people that say, I love conflict, Amira, and I never shy away from it. And I'm like, okay, how well do you deal with it? Because sometimes that's a bit too eager and I would love to see you in action. And then I have my other people that are like, oh no, Amira, it's just not a big deal. Like, it's fine. Like, you don't need to make it a big deal. So the one thing about conflict is usually we need to reframe it. Like, disagreement are healthy. It allows us to have a different perspective and to challenge each other. The next thing is, how do you approach conflict? and being aware of that. So in terms of a model, I'm going to give you the 3 stages of conflict. So it's a little bit different to the model because everyone is quite unique. But I think there's a few things to be aware of, because once we shift into a conflict state, we then communicate from a different space, and usually an unhealthy space. So just bear in mind, if we can catch things earlier on, we're not trying to eliminate conflict, but we are trying to be aware of it so that we can resolve it a bit quicker. So there's 3 stages of conflict. How we move through those 3 stages are very different for each of us. And what those 3 stages look like are also different. So I'm going to give you the 3 stages, and then I'll explain a little bit more. So one of the stages could be that you analyze. So as soon as you go into a conflict mode, you like to find out more. That might be that you need to take yourself away from the situation, weigh things up, and then come back to it. Or if you're analyzing conflict, it could be that you tend to ask more questions. Somebody else might find that annoying, but you're asking questions because you want to clarify, you want to understand, and you want to resolve that situation. Now, the other thing before I go into the other 2 ways of how you can respond to conflict is we tend to not realize when we shift into a conflict state, because we've got such a negative connotation of it. We think it's when we're arguing or when we're shouting or when we're fighting, but usually it's just a really subtle shift. So for me, I shift into conflict when I feel unsettled. So as soon as I start overthinking something or a situation, I know I've shifted into a conflict state. It's very good to be aware of like what triggers you, because usually it's a very, very subtle thing. So you could analyze conflict, you could accommodate, and this is usually where you're going to appease. You will take into somebody else's opinion into consideration, and you'll just want to accommodate them and find a very quick solution so that you can avoid that confrontation. Or you may assert yourself. Now, asserting yourself doesn't mean necessarily like being aggressive, but it does mean that you're usually going to want to approach the conflict head on. These are my people that are like, yeah, I don't mind it. I just want to find a solution and get this resolved. So they're the 3 stages. Different people will do different things in stage 1, 2, and 3. So the other thing to bear in mind is what we really want to aim for is knowing when we've shifted into conflict and trying to resolve conflict sooner rather than later. Because the more we go into stage 2 and stage 3, the more irrational our behavior becomes, the more we take the focus off the other person, and the more kind of self-centered we become. And that's why our behavior and our communication then becomes quite irrational. So I feel that is a good high level kind of concept to be aware of.
Thank you. I like that. So, Amira, as we start to wind down, besides taking, you have a 3-month course on communication, you do one-on-one training, you do corporate training. These are all ways that people can work with you to upgrade their communication. If they weren't going to do those things, what could they do? Is there books to read? Is there websites? Like, what would you recommend them to do to increase their communication?
Definitely, I love that. So one thing, I'm going to give a few book recommendations. I also have a podcast. So I have like solo guests and guest episodes. Don't always have to just listen to mine. There's great other communication podcasts out there. But definitely podcasts are great bite-sized ways. I know everybody is different. Everybody loves to learn differently. I get my people that are like, Amira, I hate podcasts. I'm always like, just give mine a try. Solo episode is very bite-sized. A couple of books that are really great in terms of communication, because the biggest thing, if you want to get better and feel more confident, is you have to do and you have to practice. You aren't going to get better at communicating if you're not practicing. So try and find some sort of accountability as well. A couple of books that are really great. Disagree Better is a great one. It's by Tammy. I think the surname I want to say is Hemworth, but I will double check that afterwards. A great kind of like old classic for Dale Carnegie is How to Win Friends and Influence People. Like absolutely great one. I'd say they're great starting ones, great starting points, especially around understanding like how to adapt, how to build better connections. And because conflict, I think, actually happens way more than we think, it's also a great insight. So whether you're listening to a podcast, whether you're reading a book, there's some good resources to kind of start with.
Amazing. Thank you, Amira. So, and your podcast is called Open Up, if I'm not mistaken. And what is the Instagram and the website that we can go to?
Yes, of course. It's called Open Up with Amira. So if you just type it into Spotify or to Google Podcasts or to Apple, it will come up straight away. And if you go to @the_communication expert, which is my social, you will also find the podcast link there as well.
Amazing. Amira, thank you so much. This is their communication expert. And we'll sign off. And thank you, everyone, for listening and being with us today. Have a great day, everyone.